So now we've got our lovely even layers. It's time to stack them up and crumb coat them.
Absolutely. So I feel like this is the most intimidating part of the cake decorating process for a lot of people. You just finished your cake and now you actually have to move them, which can be tricky depending on how fragile or firm they are. So step one, we're going to put it on the cake stand.
Right. So here we've got actually a turntable, and this is really great for decorating because it spins. It doesn't really matter what brand, they're all kind of the same, but it's just really helpful, and you'll see later when we're crumb coating why, but the fact that it spins, you can actually hold your palette knife steady, and it kind of does the work for you. But if you don't have one, that's okay. You can use a cake stand or some kind of rimless platter.
So depending on how moist your cake is, you'll either want to put one smear of frosting down on either your cake board or your turntable before you start layering them up. Or like ours, which are a little bit more moist, I think it's fine. They're probably going to stick as they are. So we already put one of our layers onto our cake board. Now it's time to add more. So we're going to start by adding a layer of frosting. We don't necessarily have to use frosting. Maybe you would want to use jam or pudding or something else delicious in your cake, but we're going with frosting today. So I think depending on how detail-oriented you want to be about this, you can measure out how much frosting you're using, or you can just do like we're doing and just do nice big dollops of it onto your layer cake. You want to add enough here because once you start layering your cakes, you can't go back and add more frosting in between. So I'm going to smooth it on. Whoops.
So at this point, let's say your layers are pretty much even, but maybe when you were trimming them or when you pop them out, there's just a little teensy bit of a slope. And it's so small that you didn't want to trim it, but it might end up being visible later. You can use the frosting here to kind of even it out.
Absolutely. And that's a great tip for kind of faking a perfect cake. No one's going to make it absolutely perfect, so use your frosting as your friend. It can kind of help you change the curvature of what you're working with.
Exactly.
So that seems like enough. Don't be too worried about there being too much, because if it squeezes out the sides at this point, you could use that extra frosting as part of your crumb coating, which is very good. Our cakes are pretty delicate, so instead of moving them by hand, I'm going to use 2 spatulas. We have 2 very large ones here. It's a good tip for moving cakes that might break apart on you otherwise. So I'm going to scooch both underneath, thank you, Sherry, and just lift all at once, place it, and carefully remove my spatulas. Thank you. Excellent.
Yep. And, you know, again, of course you can use your hands, but also if you, let's say, use your hands and it cracks apart in the middle, that's okay too. Don't panic. You can just kind of squish it back together. It happens to the best of us. And again, frosting hides all sins. So you're not going to see the middle. Just make sure that it's together, and then you'll kind of shellac it with the frosting. Absolutely. And use it as kind of a mortar or glue to keep it together. So don't panic.
I know, don't freak out. Frosting in your crumb coating is basically like the Spanx of the cake world. It's gonna hide whatever lumps, bumps, and mistakes there are underneath there anyway, so don't fret. All right, so I'm actually gonna move the second one with my hands then, just to see. Maybe it'll crack. Maybe we can show everyone how cool it is when it cracks.
All right. Practice what we preach.
Yes. Cake fails included.
Yeah.
So I'm just adding, I like a lot of frosting in between my layers, so I'm just gonna go ahead and add a little more.
That also makes it extra tall and extra dramatic.
Yes. And then one thing to know about the final layer of cake that you'll put on top of your layered cake is that you should put it bottom side on top. That way you have the flattest possible part at the very top of your cake. So I'm going to flip mine, since this is the bottom. Let's see if it breaks on me. Not yet.
No problem.
Here I thought I was going to show you guys a cake fail. And just move it around so it's even and smoosh it in.
So you see, the bottom will always be the flattest.
Yes.
Even if you've done everything we've recommended and they're super even, you just can't compete with the bottom of a cake pan. So see how flat that is.
Yes. Our cakes were pretty flat to begin with, but if you needed to, you could trim off the domed part of your cake to make sure it's a little bit flat and then flip that over just as we did here to stack them. So
right, you don't want to leave it domed and flip it over, because then your frosting layer in between it'll be really wide at the edges and then really tight in the middle. So either way, trim those cakes.
Totes. So I think this looks pretty good. I'm just going to kind of press down and make sure it looks even all around. But I think that looks good. Do you
Yeah.
want to give it a little crumb coat?
Yeah, so this next step is called crumb coating. And a lot of people skip this step, a lot of home cooks skip this step because it's an extra step, but it makes such a huge difference and you should really, really invest the time. And it's super easy. It just takes a little extra time, but it's really easy. So all the crumb coat is just a really, really thin skim coat of frosting on the outside. And you can think of it as primer, like before you paint or before you put makeup on. It'll help the final frosting really stay in place, and it also, I don't know if this is exactly why it's called a crumb coat, but I like to think of it this way, it'll trap any crumbs that come off your cake as you frost it. And that way it won't get caught in your outer layer of frosting, and it'll be really nice and clean.
You see, I think that's why a lot of people just don't think that they're good at frosting cakes. They get all the crummy bits in it, it doesn't look so great, and they think, oh, I'm just not good at this. But the reality is, a lot of people don't know that you're supposed to crumb coat your cakes, and this fixes everything.
So I just put a bunch on the top. You don't really need that much. So everything you see here I'll use on the sides as well. So not all of this is going on the top. So you just quick back and forth motion, and this is key. This offset and the mini version as well. These are two tools, if nothing else from this video, you glean nothing else, please get these. These are essential for frosting, for decorating, for everything. A butter knife, you could use it, but it's just not the same.
It's not gonna do the trick.
No. And they're just perfectly shaped for this kind of back and forth frosting motion. So I'm just pushing it back and forth here, and then eventually, once it covers most of the top, I'm gonna start pushing it down over the sides. And this is where that turntable is kind of nice to have, because I don't have to physically move the platter.
And I like to keep a little small bowl handy. As Sherry was saying about the crumb coating, it's okay to get crumbs in this layer of frosting. I personally like to, when I do get crumbs on my offset spatula, kind of just wipe them off in a small bowl to keep them separate from the clean frosting you have in this bowl. And another good tip is that the bowl of frosting that you use to crumb coat your cake should be different than the bowl of frosting you use to frost your cake ultimately at the end. That way you don't get any crumbs in it and you're not contaminating the frosting you're using for the real deal.
Exactly. So you'll see here, you know, this cake is so lovely and moist, but the crumbs are coming off, and this is exactly why we're doing it. This makes sure that it doesn't, again, taint our final coat of frosting on the outside. And what's gonna happen is it kind of gets trapped in this coat, and we're gonna refrigerate it after we get this nice thin coat all over it. And the refrigeration will actually set the crumbs, and so that they won't move around when it's time to do your final frosting. So see, I have some crumbs here. I'm just gonna wipe it off. I don't want too much now.
Because your buttercream is made with so much delicious butter, it'll harden in the fridge just like a stick of butter would. So it'll be nice and sort of that sticky, tacky hardness that you get in a stick of butter that lets you move things around and add things on top of it very nicely.
So you'll see as we go along, this is about as thin as you want. You don't want it very thick.
All right, I'm gonna get in there and help you on this side
please
because I can see.
And see, so there are these big crumbs. I'm gonna wanna scrape these off just to keep the chaos a little controlled.
And you use the flat part of your offset spatula to really kind of work and get those nice flat edges on the side of your cake as well. Use your tool to your advantage since that's what it's made to do. Yeah. One other thing I really like about crumb coating is that this is a great way if you wanted to add vanilla frosting or a light colored frosting to a really dark cake. It kind of gives it a nice neutral base coat so that the cake doesn't show through later on when you try to frost it.
Exactly. And what we were saying about the crumbs is especially important if your cake's chocolate and your frosting's vanilla, which would be an amazing combination. And you don't want those little brown crumbs showing up in your pristine vanilla frosting.
They look like they're ants in your frosting.
Yeah, no one wants that. All right. So, and then every once in a while, you might notice I'm using a clean spatula. I'm going into the bowl, and you might just want to patch a little bit. Like, I couldn't get it all the way down there, so.
There you go. I see a spot over here for you as well. Oops, I did the wrong spatula. Don't tell Sherry.
Right. You're tainting my frosting.
Sorry.
So then, you know, you just want to make sure it's all covered. down to the very bottom. And that's the great thing about frosting. Again, you don't have to take it super seriously. Just add more frosting. It will cover a lot.
It's basically delicious edible glue.
Yeah.
All right.
So see, the smaller mini offset, it's just great for this more precise work, just like getting into little corners and like right at the very bottom. And you'll notice our cake is actually sitting on a cardboard base or a cardboard form. And that's really handy because then you can move your cake off the turntable onto your cake stand, into the fridge, you know, with making sure it's not on this tall thing.
Because most people's refrigerators, you can't fit a cake stand and a cake in it. It's very large. So it's a nice tool to have for transportation.
Yeah, and you can just get that at any kitchen supply store. They have tons of them and they're like $1. You want it just a smidgen bigger than your cake.
Yeah, I like frosting cakes with you.
Yes, it's very therapeutic. So we're all done here and we're just gonna slide it off the turntable. And see how easy that you couldn't do that if you didn't have the cardboard base. So we're all set here. Now we just go in the fridge for 20 to 30 minutes or until the outside, you'll feel it, it'll set and be a little kind of dry and tacky. And then later on, we'll have lots of different ways to decorate this bad boy.